In the dead of a September night, a United States military drone strikes a small boat in international waters near Venezuela. All 11 people were killed. Days later, another attack. More dead. The US government says the targeted boats were trafficking drugs.
We have a lot of drugs pouring into our country. These came out of Venezuela, coming out very heavily from Venezuela.
But then refuses to provide any evidence that a drug operation was being carried out. After that, nuclear-capable warships along the Caribbean coast begin piling up. The vessel attacks continue, killing dozens.
We will hunt them and kill them.
And the tension in the region doesn't stop there. In October, President Trump, speaking from the Oval Office, confirms reports that he's authorized the CIA to conduct covert operations inside Venezuela. It's a stunning admission of the administration's escalating aggression towards the country. The US calls these actions self-defense against narcotics traffickers coming from the country, and doesn't rule out the possibility of land strikes. The Venezuelan government calls it an act of war.
Es una agresión en toda la línea.
A war in which they have no interest in, to the point where their president Nicolás Maduro is doing a dance in public that literally calls for peace, not war. Meanwhile, legal experts, and even some of Trump's usual allies, question the legality of the boat strikes, saying they could be violating international law by killing people without any proof of criminal wrongdoing.
You have to accuse them of something, you have to present evidence.
For the first time in years, it feels like the Caribbean is teetering on the edge of a military conflict between the United States and Venezuela. But why, out of all the hotspots in the world, is the US focusing its anger on this one poor Latin American nation? It's a confrontation that's been building for decades.
Great changes have come to Venezuela in recent years. I'd like you to join me on a journey to this modern country.
Back in the mid-20th century, Venezuela was one of the richest countries in Latin America, mainly because it had a shit ton of oil. One of the biggest natural oil reserves in the world, in fact. In return, the US provided it access to the world market and international legitimacy, as American companies like Exxon and Chevron operated in the country. It was a convenient relationship that offered both countries clear advantages, as long as the oil between them flowed freely. When the entire world felt the oil shocks of the 1970s, supply shortages from the war-torn Middle East drove oil prices sky high. This was an awful experience for almost everyone, except for Venezuela, which suddenly found itself with the highest per capita income in Latin America. Wanting to maximize its profit-making machine, the Venezuelan government nationalized its oil industry, asserting central control over its vast reserves. Still, relations with the US remained relatively stable. Then the Middle East embargo ended, and oil prices crashed in the 1980s. The resulting economic downturn sparked widespread discontent across Venezuela, opening the door for one man to change everything.
Haré cumplir, impulsaré las transformaciones democráticas necesarias.
In 1999, Hugo Chavez came to power, promising a leftist Bolivarian revolution. His socialist tendencies and desire for national independence signaled a new defiance of the United States. He used Venezuela's oil wealth to fund massive social programs, reduce poverty, and secure loyalty, a move that threatened the American business interests that dominated the region for decades. And if there's one quick way to piss off a world power, it's to have a bunch of oil and be stingy with it. At the same time, Chavez tightened his grip on his own power. His presidency brought a major decline in Venezuelan democracy and widespread corruption at every level of government. He also steered Venezuela toward new allies, Cuba, Russia, China, and Iran, aligning the country directly against American interests. To Washington, Chavez wasn't just another leftist leader in Latin America, which they historically have had issues with, but the newest symbol of anti-American resistance on this side of the globe, all while effectively ending a Venezuelan democracy that had existed since the 1950s.
We have been concerned with some of the actions of Venezuelan President Chavez and his understanding of what a democratic system is all about.
Relations soured to the point where the US supported unsuccessful opposition groups in Venezuela, and Chavez accused the CIA of plotting coups. It had become a kind of Cold War of words and ideology. But they still continued diplomatic relations. The one thing keeping this cooperation alive was, of course, Venezuela's oil, its long-standing and sole source of leverage. When Chavez died in 2013, his vice president Nicolás Maduro took power. A former bus driver and trade union leader, Maduro was widely seen as a continuation of Chávez's movement, but he quickly faced far greater problems that torpedoed Venezuela into crisis after crisis. An unsustainable majority of Venezuela's economy under Chavez's programs relied on its oil exports. So when both oil prices and production collapsed, the economy collapsed with them. By 2015, inflation had skyrocketed to 800%, hunger worsened, and Maduro, far less popular than Chavez, cracked down hard on critics. Maduro also continued Chavez's attacks on the political opposition, rewriting Venezuela's constitution in 2017 to cement his grip on power. The United States labeled him a dictator, and sanctions that further damaged its weak economy continued. Within a couple of years, Venezuela went from an oil superpower to an economic disaster zone, a classic case of a failed petrostate. Hyperinflation and hunger drove millions to flee the country, starting in 2014.
Coming here today to the Security Council, our message is simple. It's time for the United Nations to act.
Tensions reached a new level in 2019, after Maduro claimed a new presidential term in an election widely seen as corrupt and illegitimate by election analysts. Vice President Mike Pence phoned Venezuela's leading opposition candidate, Juan Guaido. Pence told him that if he publicly challenged Maduro's presidency, he would have the full support of the United States. The next day, Guaido did just that. Within minutes of declaring himself interim president, Guaido is recognized by the United States and several other Latin American countries. But it turns out you can't just declare yourself president and have it automatically take effect. Guaido wasn't able to win over the Venezuelan military to his side, so Maduro just stayed where he was. Guaido ultimately dropped his bid for power. While unsuccessful, Guaido's challenge to Maduro marked a moment where the US openly backed full regime change in Venezuela. Maduro called the entire episode a US-backed coup aimed at seizing his country's oil reserves and cut diplomatic ties with the United States.
We seek a peaceful transition of power, but all options are open.
To reinforce their aggressive stance toward Venezuela, Trump's Department of Justice indicted Maduro and his inner circle in 2020, alleging they had turned the country into a criminal and drug-running enterprise. They also announced a $15 million bounty for information leading to Maduro's arrest. This move was largely symbolic, but still, formally indicting another head of state is highly unusual. The escalation was undeniable. When the Biden administration took office in 2021, it initially continued a similar policy toward the Venezuelan regime, also refusing to recognize Maduro as its official leader. Then, opportunity for de-escalation arose in 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine. To offset rising oil prices caused by sanctions on Russia, the Biden administration reached a deal with Maduro in 2023, easing oil sanctions, in exchange for promises to hold a free and fair election in Venezuela the following year. But when the time came for Maduro to hold up his end of the bargain, the US didn't like what it saw. The Venezuelan government blocked and even jailed political opposition candidates for the 2024 election. Once again, international election analysts widely considered this election to be illegitimate due to its rigging. Despite convincing evidence proving he lost, Maduro assumed a third term, and the Biden administration reinstated economic sanctions and raised the bounty on his arrest to $25 million. Now we're in 2025, with Donald Trump back in the presidency. He ramps up his hardline stance against Maduro, declaring Venezuela a hub for narcotics and terrorism.
Trafficking networks led by Nicolás Maduro.
He doubles Maduro's bounty to $50 million, twice more than what the US sought for Osama bin Laden's arrest. He also increases the number of warships to patrol the waters in the area. Then, the strikes on the boat vessels begin. Throughout September and October, at least 6 boats are destroyed in the Caribbean, killing dozens. The Trump administration justifies the attacks by saying the boats were trying to smuggle drugs into the US, but doesn't provide any evidence to back up their claims. And they don't stop at just vessel strikes.
Why did you authorize the CIA to go into Venezuela?
I authorized for 2 reasons, really.
When Trump publicly confirms he approved covert CIA operations inside Venezuela, experts say it's the latest sign that the administration isn't focused on just stopping drug operations, which they insist is their main goal, but is aiming to trigger full-on regime change in Venezuela. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has long taken a hawkish stance on the country, arguing that Maduro should be forcibly removed from power.
There's only one plan, and that is Maduro leaves.
As for the airstrikes on the vessels, there is little evidence that they're strategically aimed at stopping drug trafficking. If the goal were truly to prevent cocaine from reaching the United States, these strikes are in the wrong ocean. Most cocaine shipments travel through the Pacific, not the Caribbean. Regarding fentanyl, which Trump has claimed is on some of the attacked boats, fentanyl usually comes from Mexico, not Venezuela. In fact, the aerial footage released by the administration has not shown any bags of drugs on any of the vessels. This confrontational approach appears more like a signal to Maduro, and the rest of the world, that the US is willing to militarize its opposition to his leadership. using force if they deem necessary.
I think Venezuela's feeling heat.
So if this is about toppling Maduro, why? Why would it be worth the money, the risk, and the international criticism for Trump, who has called himself the president of peace, to get dragged down in a foreign conflict? I'd break it down into 3 main strategic objectives. Number 1 is what the administration publicly professes, to end the drug trade rolling through the continent into the United States. The US has labeled Maduro a narco-terrorist, alleging ties to drug trafficking networks that contribute to the US drug crisis. Venezuela flatly rejects these claims, and the US government's own report concludes that Venezuela has little to do with either cocaine production or fentanyl trafficking, 2 major drugs affecting Americans. With that said, the drug operations that do exist in the country have been speculated to involve government officials, including 2 nephews of Maduro's wife, who were convicted of cocaine trafficking 9 years ago. Toppling Maduro could be a real blow to cartel drug operations, at least for the time being. Number 2 is the strategic advantage it could give to the US in its competition with other global powers, namely Russia, Iran, and China. Replacing the Maduro regime with a more friendly US government could help limit the foothold that these rivals have been establishing in the region with Maduro's support. And remember, this is a socialist country in Latin America. The US has a history of stamping those out. And number 3 is the simplest and influences every part of this conflict: to lock down the oil. Even though production has declined, Venezuela still has substantial reserves. A change in government could open the door to much greater investment and opportunities for American businesses. A recent development that underscores the central role oil plays in this dynamic is the US military seizing a Venezuelan oil tanker in December and ordering a blockade on all US-sanctioned oil moving in and out of the region. Then the president himself was pretty explicit in their interest in Venezuela's oil, which they feel belongs to the US.
They took our oil rights. We had a lot of oil there. As you know, they threw our companies out, and we want it back.
When considering the possibility of forcing regime change in Venezuela, I think it's important to look at the 2 most recent examples of similar US intervention: Iraq and Afghanistan. In both cases, the United States was drawn into prolonged involvement afterward, with limited benefits. These conflicts became known as the Forever Wars, whose unpopularity Trump took advantage of in both of his victorious presidential campaigns.
We should have never been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East.
While this back and forth has been going on for decades, what makes the current moment so tense is that the US has moved on from economic sanctions to missile strikes, property seizures, and an unprecedented military buildup. Meanwhile, Venezuela is mobilizing its troops and militias to prepare for potential conflict with the US, even if war with the most powerful military in the world is the last thing they want. Meanwhile, the victims caught up in the middle of all of this are the Venezuelan people, an estimated 80% of whom live in poverty. No matter what a few powerful individuals may decide to do, this is a population already weakened by worsening starvation, punishing sanctions, and now the looming threat of military conflict at their own doorstep. And it is they who are set to pay the biggest price for anything that happens going forward.